We're pleased that you joined the webinar, and I'd now like to introduce Kathleen Sharapa, Mentor Training Facilitator and National Certified Mentor with the International Mentor Association. Kathleen has 26 years experience as a middle and elementary school principal and is the coordinator for the New Hampshire Association for School Principals. I'd also like to introduce Jill Flanders. She's a retired elementary school principal after 27 years of service. She's also an active member of the Massachusetts Elementary Principal Association and is the executive director as that organization transitioned to become the Massachusetts School Administrators Association. She was Massachusetts Principal of the Year in 2010 and is a member of the NASESP Board of Directors. She's currently consulting with the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education and the Department of Early Education and Care. Kathleen, I turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Dana, and welcome to everybody. We really appreciate you joining us at that 4 o'clock hour. And congratulations to what people are saying their successes are. Probably we need to count last week, something from last week since we're only at Monday, but there's some really great things going on out there. Dana, I think we're ready to just go ahead to the next slide. And these are the things we're focused on today. So we know about the jingle jangle. There's so many words that are associated with trauma-informed curriculum. Over the years, there's just been all different kinds of names that it's been called and still is called. And when you start to talk about this with people that really aren't in the field, you have to talk for a minute about what you mean because they really don't know. So when you're talking with parents or new staff or anything like that, I think it's important to let them know we got a wide range of vocabulary, but we're talking in a general way about the same thing. So one of the things that clinical psychologists have identified in terms of their nomenclature, what they are concerned about when they're working with their clients and families and students and staff is the outcome of trauma. And that outcome and how it's displayed is a simple word, anxiety. When someone has been subjected to long-term toxic stress, this is resulting in anxiety, and it can exhibit in so many different ways: behavioral issues, social emotional issues, learning issues. And those of you in the audience who are educators, I think you know all about this. But there's something even bigger at play here. And if you've ever had the opportunity to hear Dr. Her name just popped out of my mind, Natalie Harrisburg. So what she has done, which is very alarming, and other researchers have uncovered that when you have early trauma in your life, that actually is a life shortener by 20 years. So people that have experienced trauma and never really had it adequately resolved are subject to 7 of the 10 causes of death, and it happens so much faster for them. So the stakes are really high. What we're trying to do with young people is so critical, not only for today and for now and for their pre-K 12 education, but for their futures as people. So I'd like to ask each of you if you would take a minute with me, because there is an antidote to all of these problems that can come from toxic stress, and that is found in building relationships. And of course, the foundational piece of the relationship is trust. So when we're working with young people, we need to be able to build trust. We need to be able to build it quickly. And to illustrate this, I'd like to do a little activity with you. And this is going to be very quick. You'll just need a piece of paper, or you can type right in on a Word document or whatever you would like to do. But What I'd like to ask you to do is name a person that you've worked with. Maybe you're working with them now, maybe it was in the past, but a person that you really trusted. They trusted you, you trusted them, great working relation. Write the name of that person down. And then I'm going to ask you 4 quick questions about this person. And please answer each question with a word or short phrase. So in relation to this person, 1, what is it like to work with this person? 2, what is it like to communicate with this person? 3, how quickly can you get something done when you're working with this person? And 4, what are the results? What's the quality of the results that you're able to achieve working together? So now I'd like to ask you to write the name of a person that you work with or worked with in the past that you do not trust. And again, a short word or phrase. 1, what is it like to work with this person? 2, what is it like to communicate with this person? 3, how quickly can you get anything done? And 4, what is the quality of the results when you work with this person? Now, this is all drawn from Stephen M.R. Covey, and he has a Zoom lecture that he does. He has a lot of them that he does, and it's very good. And he's written The Speed of Trust, the one thing that changes everything. And so if you compare your answers from the person that you trust to the person that you do not trust, I think you're going to see some dramatic differences. And I illustrate this because as you are in your work settings, your ability to establish trust with all of those around you, your peers, your superiors, staff, faculty, students, their parents, the community at large, this is critical to the success of your mission. Can you go to the next one, please? So all of us that are listening, our programs are evolving. But many of us started, and some of us might still be in this place where you have a staff member or a teacher, and I've heard this, who says, I didn't get into education to deal with mental health. Well, many of us heard this at the beginning of trauma-informed initiatives, and some of us might still hear it, some of us might feel it ourselves. But the fact is, in this country, we are all confronted with serious mental health ramifications every single day. So you can't really compartmentalize, well, no, I just want to be a teacher and I just want to work on my subject area. We really have to see who's coming to us and the whole child and what is everything that they need. Now, as principals, I know we have some principals in the audience. You continue to be the most influential person in the building. So your commitment to this is very critical to its success. In New Hampshire, any of those of you who live in New Hampshire or you ever traveled through, you may or may not have realized that we have no state income tax, we have no sales tax, so we have no money. So of all the 50 states, and even including the territories, we're the 51st in terms of financial support to the schools from the state. So our state isn't really very powerful, let's say. However, the one thing that we have done, and I was actually very pleased and surprised, we did apply for a grant and we got it. We got a Project Aware grant through SAMHSA. And as a result, we have 3 towns that have been identified with. And we set up an entire office called the Office of Social and Emotional Wellness. And I'm really thrilled that they are out there in the field working. They work most comprehensively with those 3 towns. However, they have offered services across the board. We have some private practitioners who also offer services in mental health across the board. And all of that is actually coming along very, very well. And I'd like to just take a look at the next slide. Now, we administer the New Hampshire Youth Risk Survey annually, and we've done that for about the past 14 years. Many states do administer this, and the state you're in may have been administering it. And it's very interesting to look at it because if you administer it for long enough, you have the opportunity to look at trends. So here's where we're at right now this year in New Hampshire. If you have a class of 25 kids, you're going to find that 8 of them live in households where alcohol and/or drug abuse is occurring. 6 of them experience food insecurity. 4 have seriously considered suicide. 4 have been victims of or witnessed significant domestic violence, and 2 have a parent or caretaker in jail. Now, believe it or not, these statistics are actually a little bit rosier than some of the other states. In some cases, we were a little bit worse, but if you have a youth risk survey in your state, that's a really great thing to take a look at to just see overall, how is your state faring? This survey has 175 questions on it, and it's administered to high school kids. And you might think, oh, high school kids, they'll just fill in anything. But when you read their answers, you can see they did not just fill in anything. These are very true responses, because as you watch the numbers go up and down across those 175 questions, they do make some sense.
Thank you, Kathleen. Most of the statistics that Kathleen has shared with you bring us right back into our topic for today on trauma-conscious leadership. It's important to know who is with you in your school community, and that's more than just the children that come into your service, but it is all of the adults that you touch as well on a regular basis. And so, taking into consideration the components of your leadership style and how you open these conversations does have a basis in your own community's history, as well as in your state's history. The slide we have here in Massachusetts is a short snippet of why trauma-informed leadership, has now arisen to the top of what's important for us to be doing. In 2020 in Massachusetts, a very just a very heartbreaking situation happened with the suicide of a high school student. That did happen in the community where I was a principal at that time in South Hadley. What the immediate ramifications of that public suicide was, though, ended up in legislation in our state around anti-bullying prevention. And from that focus, we really took a more deeper dive into social emotional learning. What is the important components of it? What is important to be doing with children at every stage of development, and that it's not a standalone component of public education. That social emotional learning has got to be intertwined with everything that happens in your school, from the moment children actually get on the bus to the moment they are leaving your care. I think one of the things that we didn't do very well in Massachusetts was to take the time to reflect on our own trauma issues as adults and work through faculty and staff mental health issues. And so over the past 11 years now, we are trying to take that step back, we're trying to do a much better job at it. And again, reinforce the concept that social emotional learning, trauma-informed practice, and mental health awareness is not a separate component of what you do in education. It actually is the whole 9 yards. I was working with an early educator just about 2 weeks ago now, who started off her presentation by just reminding everyone that in the birth to age 8 world of early education, social emotional learning is child development, is mental health, is all about more than one person, the child, but is about a whole family and their connections. It's interesting, though, in Massachusetts that we have this dichotomy of wanting to always be the smartest and the best in the country. And what we're trying to learn to do now is to take that step back from the focus on academics to really realign our priorities in terms of social emotional learning and mental health. I think the one thing that I want to be sure that we talk about and reinforce as we're talking about trauma conscious leadership today is that you really do need to start with yourself, with your own reflection, with your own acknowledgement that everyone has now experienced trauma of the pandemic over the last year. And how is that influencing the decisions you're making and the relationships you're building with those you work with in your schools? Kathleen, go ahead.
Okay, so let's see. What indicators of success show that your school district's trauma-informed system is working? Well, that's a tough one, and we can come at it in a lot of different ways. So in some formal type of way, we probably don't put these words on it at school, but there are qualitative assessments and quantitative assessments to start looking at. I mean, unfortunately, since we've been gone so long, you really need to recalibrate. So let's think about qualitative assessments for a minute. Well, we'll take a look at the quality of your collaboration and your community partnerships. How strong were those over the pandemic? Where are they now? Where are you going to go with them? We have the trust and commitment that you have between and among your staff, your kids, your families. What is just your gut feeling? What are you seeing? What kind of stories have been circulating? These are all qualitative measures. How about your school culture and climate? What kind of read are you getting there? If you're not really sure, this is a great opportunity to do some focus groups and just ask some questions and allow people to give feedback, staff to talk about what's happening, students to talk about it, family members to talk about it, student interviews. It's amazing how perceptive kids, even young kids, are when you're trying to put an initiative across a school and handle things a certain way. They notice, they see what's going on. And then we have quantitative assessments. So these are very, very helpful. Maybe you administer the ACEs to the adults in the building, or in high schools to the kids themselves, maybe even middle school level can do that. Family culture surveys, the ages and stages questionnaire. If you happen to have been involved with the SCATE, that's an excellent tool that you can use. And then just taking a look at your regular measures that you're probably tracking for other reasons, referrals, suspensions, how discipline is being handled, visits to the nurse. I guess in some ways you have to be a little bit creative about what are the measures that you've been taking while the students were all over the map in terms of whether you've been in hybrid, whether you've been out of school, whether you've been in school. But there is some opportunity to take some data about what's been going on, no matter what approach you've been using. You want to look to see, do you have a planning and action template? We want to have this, you know, the problems that we're having with sustainability based on lack of fidelity with your approach, whatever that's been. The trauma-aware curriculum has been in place for enough years now for it to start falling apart and people abandoning it and doing other things. Of course, the pandemic is one good reason to have abandoned it. What do you think, Jill?
I love that last sentence. The pandemic, I think, is already giving us a lot of excuses to re-examine what we've been doing in public education for a long time. And I certainly hope that we're going to be pretty creative about going back into school. It shouldn't be the same as it was before the pandemic. We haven't lost a whole lot. I think what we've done is gain a whole mess of new skills and some options for more successful ways to deliver deliver education in a variety of ways now. So I'm glad you ended with that. In terms of indicators of success, though, I also want to take that step back to look at what we're doing for other adults in our networks. One of the things that Massachusetts has been successful with is putting together regional networks of principal groups with focuses on trauma-informed practice, but also on early childhood education. We have, in the last year and a half, refocused on anti-racism education as well. And it's fascinating to me that all of these components have common threads that I think are essential to what needs to be going on in our schools as we're reinventing what education should look like for kids.
You know, before we leave this little section, I really want to issue commendations for the Herculean effort that's been made to reach out to kids and their families. It's just been incredible. It just shows how I'm so proud of educators because they've been so flexible and so creative and so student and family oriented. So you think about in New Hampshire, they figured out to do a graduation ceremony using the ski lifts so that everybody would be socially distanced. And, you know, it's a fantastic thrill to go up in your chair and jump out and there's your principal handing you your diploma. All the principals that did story hours in their PJs for little kids to listen to, staffs that ran parades with police escorts and went around the towns in their buses and went to kids' homes and met them in the driveway. High schools that managed to do spirit weeks, no matter what. The kids weren't at school, but they had a lot of fun and they maximized the use of social media. And it was just fun for me just to be following along with, oh, what's this day gonna be all about? And a lot of singing and dancing and just life going on. So kudos to all of you who just did and have done and continue to do a really, really outstanding job.
That's so true, Kathleen. And I think along with those things, we're trying to support our principals, our educational leaders in how hard this has been. And I've started to get a little creeped out by the thought of, take time for yourself, be sure that, you have downtime and time away. And I have to tell you, most of the principals that I know have a really hard time doing that. Again, it's one of the ways that we've tried to support our principals with the networks, with, obviously we haven't met in person, but with reinforcing just, it's totally okay to refocus on your own family during this time. But what's arisen as one of the practices in trying to, maintain this sense of relationship with your school communities, and to address the anxiety and the overwhelming, list of things to do in running our schools right now, is finding some essentially small and fairly easy ways to interact with your staff when the conversation gets uncomfortable, particularly as you mentioned early on, and talking about I didn't become a teacher to work in mental health. And to come back to that, what we've really hit on over and over again is using good children's literature as a focus to bring those conversations up, not only around social emotional learning, but around anti-racism, around mental health issues. And in our resources, as we get towards the end of our time together, we have some suggestions there for you to use, not only with your children in your school, but with your adults.
I think that's probably a good place to pause for a moment and ask our audience, if you have any questions for Jill and Kathleen, please put them in the chat so we can make sure that they're answered. And while we're waiting for you to think of your questions, my name is Dr. Martha Staley. I'm the director of the Childhood Trauma Learning Collaborative. And I know that I have about 20 questions that I've written down in the last half an hour about what you all have talked about, because you're presenting such a compelling picture of why this is so essential, that we have all been experiencing trauma on such a long and sustained significant way over the last year, which is a different way of looking at trauma, obviously, and the consciousness has now been raised for so many people who hadn't thought of that. But I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the overwhelm that people in schools are feeling with having to think about academics and being trauma conscious leaders and getting kids in school and keeping them safe. And I wonder if you would talk a little bit about where people can start when they're feeling overwhelmed in these circumstances. Either one, either one of you.
There's no doubt that if you're experiencing burnout, which everybody is, that mostly people who are experienced in the field, and this is very supported by the research, is the single most deterrent for burnout is professional conversations with like-minded people. So if you have the opportunity to form any group whatsoever, or utilize groups that you already have, or reach out to the neighboring principals or the principals in your district, and it really doesn't matter what level they're at, as long as they're in a leadership role like you are, to have discussions that are around issues and concerns that you're having at work. So they don't need to be formal, but they do have to be a little bit structured so that you all have the opportunity to talk and share. That is the way to approach things. It's very relieving just to hear that somebody else is struggling. Sometimes on your worst day, you listen to your colleagues and you think, I'm so lucky I'm me. That I'm going to reframe what I'm worried about because I don't even have any of that. So I think that's a really good place to start.
I absolutely second that. I think we've had more success in Massachusetts just in offering, 45 minutes every few weeks as a place for principals to Zoom in, not necessarily having an agenda, just as a check-in to find out what's going on, what's working, what totally abysmally failed, but reassuring people that there are like-minded people out there that are here to listen, and nod politely if that's all you need to hear, but also offering the opportunity to continue those conversations outside of the group as well. I think once again, the key to most of the success in dealing around a global pandemic is strengthening the relationships that you have with your professional circles.
Like we say to kids, all you need is one friend. If you can only do this with one person, that's good enough. And not your spouse, because they're done. They don't want to hear anything more about school.
It's certainly true that as we've been talking to educators, like people are saying just how much they just want a space to be able to talk and connect and also hear strategies about what's working, and that people are, in addition to sort of the Zoom fatigue and the pandemic fatigue, also that overwhelm is making it difficult to come up with creative solutions that they might have been able to in the past. But it sounds like you're, and you can correct me if I've gotten this wrong, but it sounds like you're sort of proposing three different pieces of this, which is first the getting the information, whether so talking with people about what their experiences are, whether qualitative or quantitative, and then building our networks and our connections, and then really knowing ourselves. And Jill, you mentioned having a sense of our own trauma first, which is again, certainly something that is coming to the fore for a lot of people now as they're coping with grief, coping with the effects of systemic racism and inequity, coping with the inconsistency of schools in person, schools in hybrid, changing all of that. And Kathleen, you mentioned how important it is to have that consistency and the fidelity to a model, whatever model you're using.
Mhm.
And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about ways that educators who are being trauma conscious can build that sense of safety and consistency in their schools.
I'd be happy to share probably my biggest mistake as a principal in working through what was going to be our model in our school. In the school I retired from, it was an early education center, preschool, kindergarten, and first graders. And we were working on developing a social emotional curriculum that was really focused on young children. We weren't particularly thrilled with what was out there that was developmentally appropriate. And so we were working with a wonderful development group of parents, a local storyteller, songwriter, and then staff within the school. And as we were launching different components of it, through the faculty meetings, we would practice what we intended to do with the children in the school. And a big component of it was mindfulness and some breathing activities. We had been using Brain Gym and Second Step up in that point, but what we were doing was picking and choosing what was really working well for our group. And in a faculty meeting, as we were beginning to practice some mindful techniques, we were taking a moment to be quiet and reflective. And one of my faculty members just got up and left. And I was surprised, but we continued. And fortunately, we had such a relationship that a couple of days later she came back and she wanted to talk about it. And she goes, I was not prepared for being quiet and reflective to what came up from in my own head of my own past and my own experience with trauma. I just never expected it, and I could not stay with the group. And that's like being, just hit in the face with the things that we forgot to do well. We forgot to take the time to be careful with our own adults in our own situation. And if there was ever a moment that I really wished I could have had a year-long do-over, that would be it. We tend to be educators. We tend to focus on the children that we're responsible for, but we have to be just as focused on the adults we work in, particularly right now, coming back from this pandemic trauma that everyone has experienced in their own individual way.
That is such a powerful example of how easy it is to make an honest and human mistake, and being very focused on the trauma of the kids around us and being trauma conscious. But it's often easy to overlook our own needs. And Kathleen, it looked like you were going to say something.
Jill, that's I think we've all had versions of that story, and it kind of takes me back to that teacher comment about, I got into this to be an educator, not a mental health person. And the fact is, there is truth in that as educators, we don't have the skills. So we're tapping into and covering some things, even among our own staff, to say nothing of the kids, that we're not equipped to deal with. So we're scratching the surface, and there it all is. And now what? We really understand being kind and try to follow up with them. And so we don't really know what to do. And that's why it's so important that we have these partnerships with people who do know what to do. Clinical psychologists, social workers, people who have had the training in this, so that we can anticipate. And this goes with kids too. When you start to open your heart and then it all comes at you, and then you don't know, that's really big. I don't know what that's a lot of information. Oh, and by the way, I had the same experience, and now I'm too crushed by my own remembrances to even help you. So, you're getting into some territory that's really big. So before we even go down that road, or if you're already down that road and it's too late, you're in it now, still call these people in to say, we're opening doors here. We don't know what to do. We really need some training. We need to be able to pull you in. We need to consult with you. supervision when we get into these situations, because we want to do this the right way. You know,
That is,
about this caution.
Sorry.
Well, I'm sorry, I just got to tell you, Paul Gorky, he said that he went into a school and the principal's going to show him around, and they're doing a real good job at the school with their trauma consciousness. And so, I don't know, he felt so at ease. He shared with the principal that he had been sexually abused by a neighborhood kid. And that after this happened, he did all the things kids do at school, acted out, wouldn't cooperate, very itchy, couldn't sit still. And his teachers were always on him and punishing him, and then calling the parents, and the parents were punishing him because the teachers had called. And so they made everything so much worse. And the principal said to him, well, if you didn't tell them, then how would your teachers know this had happened? Now, I don't know why, but Paul says his lack of empathy for me re-traumatized me. And he said he imagines this is going on all the time. The people who don't know what they're doing are re-traumatizing those around them. And it really made me think that's probably very true.
that is such an important point about drawing in the professionals, the resources of the network that you've built to help you do this, understanding that none of us has all of the answers and is expected to know all of these things. And we're getting some great comments and questions in the chat, and actually a wonderful example of how colleagues can help one another. Dana reminds us that the C-TLC is using those types of support in our Compassionate Conversations series, which we invite you to join to connect with other educators. But also Dee asked if you had a framework or toolkit for these types of support groups. And Miriam offered the wonderful example of the Compassion Resilience Toolkit, which is an evidence-based framework for addressing compassion for self and others. So thank you, Miriam, for that resource. Tanya also asks a wonderful question, and please continue to ask in the chat. But before we get to Tanya's question, I want to pose to Jill and Kathleen Dee's last question, which is about how do we encourage these relationships without potentially becoming an opportunity to perpetuate negativity? Because I'm certainly been in those groups over the last year where it's support, but it can sometimes feel like by the end, oh my gosh, everything is terrible and we're all in a pit of despair. So what would you say, Jill and Kathleen, to that?
For me, I think it's acknowledging often that we're all in this together. And yes, I know that's trite. There are some fallback phrases that just keep recurring, like Maslow before Bloom, and everyone's had some level of trauma over the past year. But I think being honest about it, that we as leaders of our school communities do not have all the answers, and being open to taking risks, to being open to building and reinforcing those trusting relationships that we certainly have spent a bit of time on today, and being open to just saying, I don't know, but I will do my best to find out. I want to make a shout out to one of my colleagues and friend who's listening in today, because I can't wait to talk to her about it afterwards. But Randy Ross works with a group in Massachusetts, Social Emotional Learning Alliance for Massachusetts. And I've learned so much from her around these same topics. After being retired, it's like, but wait, I needed to know this about 25, 30 years ago. Anyway, there are just remarkable resources out there. And being open, being fallible, being willing to, take a couple of tentative steps forward and then take some back if it's not the right path for your group, to me has to be the base, the foundation for trying to keep the negativity out.
And Randy Ross offers in the chat that when there's an atmosphere of negativity among staff, it raises the issue of overall school climate, which is an issue that Kathleen brought up earlier about how that might be a sign, a symptom that there's something that needs to be addressed more deeply. And Miriam offers again that that's why maybe a framework is really important, so that it takes out some of the guesswork, right, and provides a pathway, a way for leaders to maybe have the language or draw on the resources in order to help their staff. But Tanya asks the question, what happens when your mental health supports in school are completely burned out and traumatized, or contributing to the trauma of staff?
Yes.
Which is, I think that the Paul Gorky example is a really good example of how easily that can happen. But Kathleen, do you want to address that?
Well, there are two recommendations I would make about controlling for negativity and also getting the outcomes that you want. One is, especially now since we've had the pandemic, we really have to reimagine everything. So you already may have norms, and I love the framework idea. That's right on. So when you're going to have meetings, I think it's time to reestablish your norms. What are our meeting norms going to be? Since we already know negativity is going to be a component because it keeps happening, in your norms, address how will you handle that when it comes up? And how will you make sure that it's balanced with positivity? So as we set what our norms are going to be, you know, we have to have a method for what we want our outcomes to be, and then a method to address it. So if everybody starts negative, so we have a little technique that we've agreed on in our norms that we're going to use to switch pathways now and get, we've just heard 4 negatives. What are 4 positives? Whatever your technique is. And the second thing, once you have your norms, is to establish with the facilitator, what are your expectations? Now, maybe as the principal, you are the facilitator. Maybe you have some key staff members that, you know, maybe you don't have an outside facilitator or a social, maybe you do, and that's great. But whoever, let's agree with the facilitator how we want this to go and what we want you to do if it's not going that way. So those are 2 framework kinds of things that will help quite a bit.
That sounds like a really important idea, Kathleen, that you could extend to your larger school climate, right? This idea of norms and having a set of rules or expectations about when we do this, which is a normal human thing to get kind of in the mess. What is it going to look like, or what is the expectation for moving out of that? I know as a former classroom teacher, having that in my mind when kids started to have a problem working on something, like knowing what the next step would be and establishing that ahead of time can be really, really helpful. I think that we had yes, Erica offers that our feelings about something, our process can be really contagious, either for good or ill, but starting with your own sense of your own history, your trauma, your own needs seems like a good place for leaders to start in addressing some of that affect as they bring it into school. And I'm wondering how we can help new teachers or emerging leaders build some of these skills as they're either coming into the profession or early in their careers.
Well, this is the primary mission of a mentor coach program for new principals. So we really, what research tells us is that you can speed the leadership process by about 5 years with a really good mentor, because they're helping you in that first year or 2 to find your voice and also just to understand what it is. Once you come into leadership, you really you really want to kick yourself for all the times you criticized the leader because you didn't understand what it was that they were going through, all of the things they were trying to manage all at once. And so I think a mentor or a coach can really help you sort through all of what is it you're trying to do, because one thing that it does is it allows for reflective time. When you're sitting there talking to that person and they are actually asking you, well, what's another option? Well, what would happen if you took that option? Well, let's play that option out. So now that we've looked at 3 of them, what do you think the best option is? Is there some combination of things? And by the time you've done that as a leader, you're in a pretty good place. You're going to make some good decisions that are going to be solid and helpful. So one thing I had thought about earlier, I've been doing mentor programs probably for close to 15 years. This is the first year that I've ever had the mentor say, I'm getting more out of this than the mentee. And that's because it's an even playing field. Nobody's handled a pandemic before. And they're actually doing they found a friend, they found a colleague, and they're talking equally to each other because the mentor doesn't have any more experience than anybody else does. And so those conversations are so great.
That reminds me of what we often tell kids, which is it's okay to make mistakes, right? We're all learners. We're going to make mistakes as we go along. And Miriam offered another resource in the chat, which looks fantastic. And Randy brings up the issue of racial trauma and how deep that is, in addition to and compounding the effects of the pandemic in the last year, some of those systemic, historical, intergenerational traumas that are longstanding and continue to exist. And that the current trial that's going on with in the George Floyd case is really re-traumatizing a lot of people,
Sure.
which makes me think about how school leaders in a year where they're exhausted and overwhelmed and how they can look forward. So what is the next stage? What are the next steps and how to prepare for that?
I'm glad you approached that as well, Martha. Those are incredibly uncomfortable conversations, but it doesn't mean you don't have them. In working with our network in Massachusetts, we have had some speakers come in to just offer support and some thoughts to consider. And I think one of the probably the most provocative thought for me was, do something. Don't wait until you have a critical mass of your faculty that you think is ready to begin these conversations. Start somewhere. And Ed mentioned before that what we seem to keep landing on in many of our conversations is good children's literature. One of the things that we're probably not going to get to today is discussing if there are any differences between the age of the children you're working with, whether you're with elementary, middle school, or high school students. And my answer to that is no, because you are really, truly working with your adult faculty and staff. But you can really use good, very good young children's literature to open the conversations in a more, in actually a non-threatening way. And again, there are emerging book lists right now that are absolutely fantastic to start those conversations. And it's not a bad idea to use some of them with adult faculty meetings.
I'm sorry, Kathleen, go ahead.
Oh, Jill, I really like what you're saying, especially about reaching across elementary, middle, and high school, because it's coherence that we really need in these programs, or they're going to fall apart. So yes, you might do responsive classroom morning circle at the elementary, but you're also doing community circles at the middle, and you're doing advisory at the high school, and all of that is great. But from the kids' point of view, as they're going through the grades, have these instructors talked with one another about using similar language and similar goals? Because we get them all set up, but then if they have to keep shifting and changing and there's different words and different goals, that's very confusing for kids, especially in emotional well-being. You want to be careful that this is a nice, smooth experience. We have a new opportunity here to address coherence and look at this pre-K to 12. And it's not hard. It's not this huge initiative. These are simple conversations that you have occasionally, structured conversations with people, so we all get on the same page.
That's a wonderful point, Kathleen. And I think it really addresses what I think Randy mentioned in the chat about not relying on students of color or, say, teachers of color or people who are already burdened and traumatized in significant ways to lead that conversation and structure the conversation, but to look to your curriculum and those sort of fundamental pieces for information and ways of discussing this in a way that's consistent across the ages. And I wish that we had more time to talk more about how you can do these things in different settings and with different ages. But we are going to have to wrap up in a couple minutes. So I just wanted to give each of you a moment for a final piece of advice to our school leaders. Kathleen, do you want to start?
Well, I wish we would have had a little more time for Randy, because Randy, you made me think about Dina Simmons, who was sharing that when she was growing up, there were a lot of shootings. She heard gunshots a lot at night. And by third grade, she was vomiting every day about this. And her response to all of it was to become an overachiever. She did the best she could at school. She's done the best she can in her career. And it's that overachievement can also be so symptomatic too. And I look at all these really quality educators that I work with and meet, and I wonder about how all those microaggressions that I saw there in the chat, and it's just a whole new area to be thinking about. So thank you, Randy, for everything you've mentioned. We could have another whole thing just on what you brought up in the chat.
Thank you, Kathleen. And what about you, Jill?
I'm struck with how we need to be flexible right now. There are no right or single correct answers as we're moving ahead now. The openness that I talked about before, the willingness to try things and be okay if it doesn't work, and then to take a step back, reassess, and move ahead again. For me, continues to come back to the trusting relationships that you're able to build or rebuild within your school community. If my daughters were listening to this today, they would crack up with this next thing that I'm going to say, because our family tends to live by it. And my closing thought is that no one is ever entirely useless. You can always be the bad example. And so I hang my hat on that. I've been a bad example in lots and lots of ways, but usually something comes from it. So I'll end with that.
That's a wonderful place to end. We can always learn something, right? Even if in our most difficult moments. So before I pass it over to Dana for our closing comments, I just want to thank you, Jill and Kathleen, and to all of the people in the chat and our audience for providing resources and things to think about during a difficult time and a chance to connect. So thank you, Kathleen and Jill, particularly. Dana?
You're very welcome.
Yes, thank you so much, Jill, Kathleen, and Martha. And Jill and Kathleen have compiled some really great resources at the end of the slideshow that they presented, as well as some reflections and questions to ask yourself. You will receive this when you receive the recording of today's event, and it also includes their contact information. So I wanted to thank you for joining today's webinar. Our funding does come from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, which requires us to evaluate our services. So attendees that provided their email address will receive an evaluation survey around 24 hours after the close of today's event, along with the slide presentation and links to request a participation certificate if you would like that. We really do appreciate your honest and anonymous feedback, which helps provide information to SAMHSA and assists us in planning future meetings and programs. programs. Your feedback truly does count, so please take the time to answer that quick survey. We hope that you'll make plans to participate in upcoming online activities that are a part of the Childhood Trauma Learning Collaborative. Our next event is the Family Compassionate Conversation, happening on Wednesday, April 28th at 3 p.m. We invite anyone who identifies as a family member of a pre-K to 12 student to join us to talk about fostering connection. We also have a webinar coming up on May 11th, where with our partners Exhale to Inhale, who will talk to us about the benefits of using trauma-informed yoga in schools and as adults who serve children. The National Mental Health Technology Transfer Center has an 8-part learning series about our national school mental health best practices. Always and Now is the name of that series. We have the 5th module coming up on tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern, but all of the previous modules are also at the link that you'll receive, and you can watch the recordings of those to learn more about comprehensive school mental health. We really encourage you also to pay attention to your email, where you'll get an invitation to join our Basecamp library. We share lots of resources there, and Kathleen has really helped you all out by putting the link right there. You can look for it in your emails in the next week or so as well. And a lot of you talked about the desire to be a part of a community. Well, Basecamp can help you find some educators in New England to support your trauma-informed growth. Thank you so much for joining us. And if you have any questions, please email us or visit our website, the New England Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, for free resources and other opportunities. Thank you.